Have you ever seen someone get slapped on a plane, and no one rushed to defend her because they thought she didn't matter? What if the woman they dismissed turned out to be the most powerful person in the company? This isn't just about a scarf or a seat. It's about what happens when silence ends and justice takes off. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Monday morning at Midvale Regional Airport didn't look any different from the dozens that had come before it. The skies were overcast. The terminal buzzed with half-awake travelers clutching coffee cups and wheeled suitcases, moving in practice lines through security and toward departure gates. Nothing in the air said anything unusual was about to happen. Zarina Calhoun stood near gate 42B, code zip tie, one hand gently gripping the handle of a worn leather bag. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, no badge of status. Her olive green coat draped neatly over slacks and a neutral blouse. Her shoes, low-heeled and sensible, made no sound against the polished floor. She could have been anyone, a middle-aged schoolteacher, a government clerk, maybe someone flying a sea family. But she wasn't just anyone. Zarina was one of the founding executives of Nova Airlines. She had slipped into the system using a variation of her name and booked an economy ticket just like any other passenger. No corporate email, no concierge. Just a regular confirmation number, printed and folded into her coat pocket. She'd done it this way on purpose. 3 days earlier, an anonymous email had landed in her inbox. A quietly worded complaint from someone on the inside. No names. Just a warning. Some of your staff treat passengers of color differently, especially women. It's subtle, but it's there. She'd read it twice, then closed her laptop without replying. She didn't need to. She'd already made her decision. So here she was, flying from Atlanta to Chicago on flight NA-217, seated in 14C, the aisle seat. She planned to observe everything. Boarding procedures, how flight attendants treated passengers, who they smiled at, who they ignored. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass. "Enjoy your flight," he said politely, not knowing who she was. As she walked down the jet bridge, a man in a Navy uniform stepped in from the side, older, quiet, clipboard in hand. "Ms. Calhoun," he said softly, "from guest relations, for the draft." He handed her a rolled gray scarf. "To keep warm. No one else knows." Zarina nodded, tucked the scarf around her neck, and entered the aircraft. Row 14 was still empty. She placed her bag beneath the seat in front and settled in. She noticed a flight attendant standing a few rows up, blonde, tall, in her late 30s, maybe early 40s. Her name tag read, Lydia Cresswell. Lydia greeted passengers with a trained smile, firm but polite. But when her eyes met Zarina's, the smile didn't quite reach her face. She gave a faint nod, no words, and moved on. Zarina had seen that look before. The plane filled quickly. A child cried somewhere near the front. Overhead bins slammed shut one after another. Zarina stayed quiet, observing, eyes calm but alert. Just before takeoff, Lydia moved through the cabin, checking seat belts and tray tables. As she passed Zarina's row, her gaze caught on the scarf. She stopped. "That scarf," she said quietly, bending slightly. "Where did you get it?" Zarina looked up, meeting her eyes. "It was given to me by your staff. Guest relations." Lydia's expression didn't change. "Those aren't handed out in economy." "I didn't ask for it," Zarina said evenly. "But it was offered." Lydia straightened, her lips pressed into a line. "I think I need to take that back." Zarina didn't flinch. "You're making assumptions based on nothing," she said, voice low but clear. "Be careful with that." There was a flicker, just a flicker, of something in Lydia's eyes. Surprise? Offense? She didn't say anything else. Just turned and walked briskly up the aisle. Zarina sat back in her seat and closed her eyes as the plane began to taxi. She wasn't angry. Not yet. But something inside her shifted, a quiet, familiar heat rising from her ribs up to her throat. She breathed through it. She wasn't here to pick a fight. She was here to watch. Still, she knew that look. She knew that tone. and she had a strong feeling this flight wasn't going to be as uneventful as the rest of the passengers hoped. The seatbelt sign had just turned off when Lydia passed by again with a tray of drinks. She offered apple juice and club soda to the man in 14A, asked the woman in 14B if she wanted ginger ale, and then paused just briefly at Zarina in 14C. Her hand didn't move. No offer. No eye contact. She stepped past as if Zarina weren't there at all. Zarina didn't say a word. She just leaned slightly into the aisle, watched Lydia continue down the row, and then sat back. Her fingers found the edge of the armrest and tapped once, softly. It wasn't the drink. It wasn't even the look. It was the way the air changed when someone decided you weren't worth acknowledging. It wasn't the first time she'd felt it. She closed her eyes for a moment. Her mind slipped backward, 20 years ago, a crowded lecture hall at Arkansas Technical. Zarina had been the only black woman in her aviation policy class. One day, she'd asked a professor a question about commercial airspace rights, and he chuckled before answering her with, "That's a little advanced for someone with your background, isn't it?" Back then, she hadn't responded. She'd just nodded, wrote the answer in her notebook, and stayed quiet. But she'd remembered. Every word, every look, every classroom door she'd had to push through without knowing who'd try to shut it in her face. Now sitting on this flight, her own airline, her own seat, Zarina felt that same sting. She glanced sideways. The man in 14A had noticed too. He looked to be in his early 30s. White, neatly dressed, a pair of thick glasses sliding down his nose. He held a travel mug in one hand and a tablet in the other, but now both rested on his lap. "That wasn't very professional of her," he said, almost under his breath, but loud enough. Zarina turned slightly toward him. "You caught that?" He gave a short nod. Hard to miss. They exchanged a look. A quiet one. A look that says, "I see it too." "I'm Ethan," he offered, reaching out a hand across the empty middle seat. "Zarina," she said, shaking it. Ethan hesitated, then said, "I don't mean to be nosy or anything. But the way she looked at you, that wasn't about a scarf." Zarina smiled faintly. "No, it rarely is." He hesitated again, then added, "My grandfather marched in Montgomery. Civil rights stuff. I never met him, but my mom says he couldn't sit through dinner if someone made a joke about race." She called it righteous indigestion. That made Zarina chuckle, softly. "He sounds like someone I would have liked." Ethan nodded. "He would have liked you too." The conversation paused as Lydia returned, this time with snack bags. She handed one to Ethan with a smile, reached past Zarina as if she wasn't there, and continued on. Zarina looked straight ahead. Her voice was even when she said, "Some people weaponize kindness. Some just leave it behind altogether." Ethan sat up straighter. He didn't say anything for a moment, then quietly reached down, tapped his phone, and opened the voice memos app. "You're recording?" Zarina asked, not alarmed, just curious. "Audio only," Ethan replied. "She keeps saying things under her breath. Little things. I figured someone ought to remember them. If it gets worse." Zarina studied him for a second. "You think it's going to get worse?" He shrugged. "Maybe. But I've seen enough to know when something's off." She leaned back in her seat and turned toward the window. "You've got good instincts." There was silence again, but not uncomfortable. Ethan went back to his tablet. Zarina folded her hands in her lap, the gray scarf still tucked neatly across her chest. Lydia passed once more, stopping 3 rows up to chat with a couple in business attire. She laughed at something the man said, light and charming. Then her eyes flicked back toward row 14. The smile faded just slightly. Zarina didn't move, but her pulse had changed. She could feel it in her wrists. She wasn't angry yet, but the heat was there. Sometimes racism wasn't a slur or a punch. Sometimes it was polite silence, a drink not served, a glance that lasted too long, and sometimes it started with a scarf. Zarina looked at Ethan again. He didn't say anything, but he gave her a quick nod. She returned it. The plane flew steady, cutting through gray clouds outside the cabin window. Inside, something else was beginning to rise. Not a storm, but the pressure before it breaks. The aisle was narrow, But Lydia moved through it with a kind of tight energy, controlled, but barely. Every tray she handed out landed on the table a little too fast. Every smile she gave the other passengers stretched a little too thin. Zarina watched her without turning her head. She didn't need to. The tension was moving through the cabin like a storm cloud that hadn't quite broken. She could feel it behind her eyes. The scarf still rested lightly across her chest. She hadn't touched it since it was handed to her, hadn't adjusted it, hadn't flaunted it. But Lydia couldn't seem to look away from it. They were serving snacks now. Crackers, little plastic cups of ginger ale, and cola. The cart rolled up slowly, and Lydia was on the left side, Zarina's side. When she reached row 14, she paused. Her tone wasn't loud yet, but it carried. "I've warned you once," she said, staring at the scarf like it had personally offended her. "I need you to return that scarf now." Zarina didn't move. Her hands were folded in her lap. "You're not in a position to demand anything from me," she said calmly. There was no bite in her voice, just fact. And that was what made Lydia snap. In one sharp, uncontrolled movement, she dropped the snack tray onto the cart, stepped forward, and slapped Zarina across the face. It wasn't hard enough to bruise, but it was loud, sharp, final. The cabin went silent in an instant. Even the baby a few rows back stopped crying. Zarina didn't touch her face. She didn't flinch. She simply turned her head to look at Lydia, whose chest was rising and falling with shallow, rapid breaths. Zarina's voice, when it came, was steady. "Could you please make sure that recording is backed up?" She didn't look at Ethan when she said it. She didn't need to. Ethan nodded once, stunned but already pulling his phone into both hands. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in 15D spoke up. "I've got it on camera too," he said. "I got the whole thing." The words seemed to echo, not just across the rows, but into Lydia's bones. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Passengers began whispering, some pulling out their phones, others simply staring. One woman 2 rows ahead craned her neck around to get a better look. No one said anything else. No one needed to. Lydia stepped back. Her hands shook as she gripped the cart. She started, but no words followed. Zarina turned back to face forward, her expression unreadable. She didn't look angry. She looked like someone waiting for a clock to tick, like someone who'd already decided how the rest of the story would go. Lydia looked around. For backup? For support? For understanding? She didn't find any. Even the other flight attendant, working quietly on the opposite side of the plane, was suddenly very busy stacking ginger ale cans. Zarina exhaled slowly, the faintest shift in her shoulders. Her cheek still held the red imprint of the slap, but she hadn't touched it. Ethan leaned toward her, speaking in a hush. "She's gonna get fired, right?" Zarina didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, "Let's just land first." Another few minutes passed before Lydia pushed the cart away. Her steps were faster now, less controlled. She disappeared into the galley near the front, the curtain swaying behind her like a retreating tide. Zarina finally blinked slowly. Her hand still hadn't moved. She hadn't expected this. Not entirely. She'd anticipated tension. Maybe a sharp comment, maybe someone asking if she was in the right seat. But not this. And yet she wasn't surprised either. There was always a line someone would cross eventually, when they thought they were untouchable. When they thought no one was watching, or worse, that no one who mattered was watching. Zarina looked down at her scarf. Still neat. Still hers. Outside the window, the sky stretched pale and endless. Clouds floated peacefully beneath them, thick and white like untouched linen. Inside, the pressure had shifted. Not in the engines. In the cabin. In the hearts of the people who saw what had happened and would remember it. Not because it was the first time something like that occurred on a plane, but because this time, someone recorded it. And this time, it wasn't going away, quietly. The landing was smooth, as if the plane had nothing to carry but silence. No one clapped. No one spoke. People shuffled to collect their things with an odd kind of stillness, like they weren't sure what the rules were anymore. Something had shifted midair, and everyone could feel it. Lydia stood stiff at the front of the cabin, face set, eyes avoiding everyone else's. She'd already made a call to the ground crew before descent, requesting a security presence at the gate. She phrased it professionally. Passenger refusing crew instructions, possible theft, disruption. Zarina stayed seated until the crowd thinned. Ethan stayed too. Neither of them rushed. Zarina hadn't said another word since the slap, and that silence had done more than shouting ever could. As they walked off the plane, the terminal was unusually quiet. No security waited at the gate. Instead, a man in a charcoal suit approached, speaking softly. "Ms. Calhoun, we've arranged ground transport for you." Lydia watched from the jetway, mouth slightly open. Zarina didn't glance back. She followed the man out a side exit where a black sedan waited, door already open. Ethan followed a few steps behind, phone still in hand. Inside the car, Zarina didn't check her reflection. She didn't need to. The sting had faded, but the meaning hadn't. She folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window as they pulled away from the terminal. At Novair's headquarters, a sleek glass building 10 minutes from the airport, she entered through a side entrance. No name badge, no press, just purpose. Upstairs, her assistant, May, stood waiting outside the boardroom. "They're all in there," May said, voice low. "Legal, PR, 2 board reps, and Lydia's union contact. She thinks this is going to be a routine HR slap on the wrist." Zarina arched an eyebrow. "She'll learn." May hesitated. "There's been talk. You could handle it quietly. Issue a light suspension, let her resign. It won't become a bigger thing if we don't push it." Zarina looked at the polished conference room door. Inside were people she'd worked with for years. People who liked her best when she played safe, when she smiled through complications and stayed out of headlines. She'd done that long enough. "No," she said simply. "This isn't just about me. This is about changing the damn pattern." May gave a small nod and stepped aside. Zarina walked in. At the far end of the table sat Lydia, trying to look composed, but her knees bounced under the table. Her eyes flicked toward Zarina, and something in her expression cracked for just a second. Confusion. Maybe fear. Across the table, Richard from PR cleared his throat. "Zarina, we've all seen the footage now. There's a lot of pressure to move fast. Contain the story. Limit exposure. Maybe let Lydia step down quietly. Issue an apology." Zarina cut in. "We're not protecting the story. We're protecting the pattern. And I won't do it anymore." She pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the table. "Here's every documented complaint in the last 5 years that was handled quietly. Do you know how many involved black passengers being treated as less than? Or how many women were told they misunderstood the tone of a crew member? Do you know how many people left that plane feeling humiliated and no one did a damn thing because it wasn't loud enough to go viral?" The room fell still. Lydia opened her mouth, then closed it again. Zarina kept going. "She hit me. On my own flight. In front of witnesses. And she did it because she thought she could." Ethan wasn't in the room, but his impact was. The video he'd sent to a friend at a small online news outlet had already been picked up by 2 national blogs. May stepped into the room again with a tablet, held it out silently. Zarina took it, scrolled for just a second, and turned the screen around. "She thought this could be buried," Zarina said. "But the world's already watching." There was a long silence. Then someone from legal asked, "What do you want us to do?" Zarina didn't hesitate. "I want an independent review of our customer service practices. I want bias training across every department, not just flight crew. I want a zero-tolerance policy that doesn't get overruled by image control." She paused. "And I want Lydia off every future Novair flight. Effective immediately." Lydia stood up halfway, looking stunned. "You can't. You're just one executive." Zarina looked at her, steady and unblinking. "I'm the executive." And this time, no one disagreed. Lydia sat stiff in the back seat of the company car, clutching a folder she hadn't opened. The ride from the airport to Novair's headquarters was barely 10 minutes, but it felt much longer. Her stomach turned in slow, sour loops. She couldn't stop thinking about how quickly everything had shifted, from a flight she thought she was in control of to a ride she didn't arrange, heading to a meeting she hadn't called. When she stepped off the elevator and onto the 25th floor, she expected an HR rep and maybe a union contact. Instead, she was ushered into a full boardroom, long table, polished wood, city skyline glowing through the glass behind it. And there, at the head of a table, sat Zarina Calhoun, not in casual travel clothes anymore. Now she wore a navy blue blazer and soft cream blouse, hair pulled back, posture composed. No one introduced her. No one needed to. Lydia froze in the doorway. She'd known the woman's name from the flight manifest, but it hadn't clicked. Calhoun was a common enough name. She thought the woman looked vaguely familiar, but didn't place her. She had assumed she was someone's aunt, maybe an underpaid consultant traveling for work. Now, Zarina was looking directly at her, without anger, without softness. Just the kind of gaze that made you aware of everything you'd done wrong before anyone said a word. The HR director, Thomas Gaines, cleared his throat and gestured toward a chair. "Ms. Cresswell, please have a seat." Lydia sat, hands tight in her lap. The room was too quiet. Zarina didn't speak right away. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room was watching her, waiting. Thomas began reading from a printed memo. As of 9:42 a.m. this morning, the passenger involved in the onboard incident has been confirmed as Ms. Zarina Calhoun, Executive Chair of Novair Group. She was traveling under a restricted ID for the purpose of internal service evaluation. He stopped, looked around, looked at Lydia. Lydia's mouth parted. She tried to respond, but no sound came out. A younger man from legal flipped through a folder, checked a printed flight manifest. "Oh my God," he muttered. "I thought she was using a pseudonym for auditing, like they do sometimes. I didn't realize." Thomas kept reading. Ms. Calhoun was not violating any policy by accepting a hospitality item from guest relations prior to boarding. There is no theft, no disruption, and your use of force is classified as a severe violation of passenger safety protocol. Lydia turned to Zarina, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who you were." Zarina replied without blinking. "You didn't see a thief. You saw what you wanted to see." The words sat in the air like a stone dropped in still water. No one dared to move. Inside, Zarina felt the tightness she'd been carrying for the last 24 hours begin to loosen, but not disappear. Her mind flickered to a different boardroom 10 years ago, when she had sat in silence while a young black father gave his testimony after being unlawfully detained in a secure zone over a mistaken ID. She'd wanted to speak up, but she'd let the legal team settle quietly, thinking that was the safer route. It had never sat right. Today, she decided that her silence wasn't going to protect anyone anymore, not even the company. Thomas closed the folder and looked at Zarina. "How would you like to proceed?" Zarina looked around the table. Not at Lydia. Not yet. At the others, the ones who'd approved customer care policy changes without ever talking to customers. The ones who still thought racism was something people could only prove if they had bruises. "I want a full report made public," she said. "And I want our employees to see that we don't just talk accountability, we enforce it." Her eyes finally met Lydia's again. "You thought you were dealing with someone who had no power. And that's the part one can't forgive." Lydia's face had gone pale. Her hands were trembling. "Please," she said quietly. "It was a mistake. I was under pressure." "We're all under pressure," Zarina cut in. "That's not an excuse. That's just when your truth shows up." There were no raised voices, no slammed fists, no dramatic exits. But when Lydia was asked to leave the room, everyone knew it wasn't just about one slap. It was about every time someone like Zarina had been pushed aside, overlooked, judged, and stayed silent. This time, silence had ended in a boardroom, and it had spoken louder than any apology ever could. By 10:17 that morning, the slap had traveled farther than the plane ever did. Local news stations ran the footage with the faces blurred, but it didn't matter. People knew what they were looking at. The crack of a hand against a face. The stunned stillness that followed. That kind of moment didn't need names. It just needed eyes and ears. Meanwhile, back at Novier headquarters, the boardroom felt like it might burst from the inside out. Attention hung there, tight, expectant, and heavy. Nobody checked their phones anymore. They didn't need to. They were living the headlines in real time. Zarina stood at the far end of the room. No podium, no script. Just a slim binder in her hands and the kind of presence that didn't need volume to command attention. "Let me walk you through exactly what happened," she began, voice low but firm. "From boarding to the slap. Here's every report I've received from passengers and employees since last quarter. Here's the footage. Here are the names of those who've come forward to confirm what they saw." She placed everything on the table with measured clarity. No dramatics, no self-defense. She didn't try to spin it. She just told the truth. And the truth was enough. A young man from marketing shifted in his seat and whispered to no one in particular, "This is bad optics." Zarina didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed steady on the chair of the board, whose expression had gone pale, his hand resting quietly over his mouth. Then Richard, older, well-respected, known for his cool head, spoke up from 3 seats down. "We appreciate your clarity, Zarina," he said cautiously. "And of course, the incident is unacceptable. But we should consider the broader impact. If we can resolve this quietly, issue a formal apology, suspend the employee." "No," Zarina said sharply. Richard blinked. He wasn't used to being interrupted, not like that. "I'm not burying this to protect a brand," she said. "I'd rather lose a few points in stock than lose my soul." That line didn't echo, but it hung there, stuck to the walls, the air, and every person's chest. Later, it would become the quote in the headlines, the pull quote in magazine interviews, the subject of a viral LinkedIn post on leadership. But in that moment, it was just raw and real and immovable. Zarina took a breath, then stepped slightly forward. "We have a choice right now," she said. "Either we show the world our values mean something, or we admit they never meant anything at all." One of the executives at the far end mumbled, "Then what do you suggest?" Zarina clicked the remote in her hand. A new slide lit up the wall. "This," she said plainly. She outlined the plan with precision. Mandatory, recurring bias and de-escalation training for every employee, from baggage handlers to board members. A real-time anonymous feedback system, where complaints could be submitted without fear of retaliation or being buried. A zero-tolerance discrimination policy, not the kind that's printed and forgotten, but the kind that means something and hurts if you cross it. Someone from PR shifted uncomfortably. "If we go public, we'll need a statement within hours." Zarina didn't flinch. "Then we'd better get started." Just then, May entered the room with a printed copy of a Reddit post. 53,000 upvotes, she said simply, holding it up. "It's already out there." Zarina gave the smallest nod. "Then we stop reacting and start leading." Later that afternoon, she called Ethan. She didn't have to. No one told her to. But she wanted to. He picked up quickly. "Zarina." "Yes," she said, voice gentler now. "I wanted to thank you. For recording. For noticing." "I just did what anyone should have done," he said. "You did everything else." "You're part of this too," she replied. "Don't forget that." He didn't know what to say, so he didn't try to say something big. "I appreciate it," he said quietly. They hung up. No ceremony. No long goodbye. Just respect, simple and shared. Back at headquarters, the PR team was already planning a press briefing. Zarina didn't ask for a script. She didn't want a speech. Because when the truth's already out in the world, the only thing left to do is stand in it. Loudly, clearly, and without flinching. The meeting room on the 23rd floor was the kind of space people avoided if they could. No windows, no sunlight, just beige walls, a too small table, and a faint buzz from the overhead lights that never seemed to shut off. It smelled faintly of printer paper and unresolved conflict. This wasn't a room for collaboration. It was for endings. Zarina sat alone at one end of the table, posture composed, a single manila folder resting in front of her. She didn't flip through it. She already knew what it contained. She wasn't here to read. She was here to close a door. The door opened quietly. Lydia stepped in, shoulders hunched, eyes darting. She looked like someone walking into a courtroom without a lawyer. Her usual sharpness, makeup, posture, that practiced customer service smile, was gone. All that remained was a woman whose power had slipped through her fingers the moment she let instinct override reason. She sat down across from Zarina without being invited. Her fingers knotted themselves in her lap. "I just want to say," she began, her voice shaky. Zarina raised one hand, not harshly, but firmly. "Don't start with sorry," she said. "Start with truth." Lydia swallowed. Her throat moved visibly. Then she exhaled in one long, tired breath. "I was under pressure. The flight was overbooked. We were understaffed. I hadn't slept and her voice cracked. I didn't know who you were." Zarina didn't blink, but something behind her eyes cooled. "That's the problem," she said, her tone flat. "You shouldn't have to know who I am to treat me like a human being." Lydia looked down. Her cheeks flushed deep red. "It wasn't about race," she murmured. "I wasn't trying to." Zarina let the silence settle between them, not as punishment, but as space. Space for Lydia to hear how hollow that sounded. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quiet. "Do you really believe that?" Lydia opened her mouth. No words came out. She looked up, then away. The confidence she once wore like a second uniform had vanished. What remained was a vague, twitching defensiveness that even she didn't seem to buy anymore. "You felt challenged," Zarina said, "by a passenger who didn't lower her eyes. You didn't see a customer. You saw someone who didn't belong." "I didn't mean for it to go that far," Lydia said, shrinking into the chair. "I lost control." Zarina didn't respond immediately. She reached forward and slid the manila folder across the table, stopping just short of Lydia's fingers. "That's our service culture guide," she said. "Published last year. You signed off on it during your annual training." Lydia stared at the folder. She didn't open it. Zarina continued. "Section 3. Non-discrimination, de-escalation, and dignity. You read that, right?" Lydia gave the smallest of nods. "You signed it," Zarina said. "But clearly you never read it." There was no raised voice, no theatrical outburst. But the sentence dropped with weight that filled the room. Lydia looked like she'd been slapped for the second time, this one silent and far deeper. Zarina stood slowly. "You're being terminated. Effective immediately. No severance. Your union has already been notified. You'll receive a formal letter outlining the investigation's findings." Lydia nodded once. Not in agreement, just acceptance. There was nothing left to defend. Zarina paused, then added softly, "I don't expect you to understand what that moment meant to everyone who saw it. But you'll remember it. That's a start." Lydia rose without a word. Her shoes tapped gently against the floor as she walked out, each step smaller than the last. When the door clicked shut, Zarina stayed standing, her breath leaving her chest like steam rising from a cooling kettle. It wasn't relief. It wasn't victory. It was release. Downstairs, the lobby buzzed with reporters. The word had gotten out. The CEO of Nova Air, previously unnamed, was about to speak. May waited near the elevator, a thick folder in one hand, phone in the other. "Got the talking points," she said. "You want to run through them?" Zarina shook her head. "No need." May raised a brow. "You sure?" "They're expecting answers." Zarina gave a half smile. "I've had a lifetime to get ready." The elevator dinged open, and they stepped into the crowd below. Cameras flashed instantly. Microphones thrust forward. Zarina stepped to the podium, without notes, without handlers. A reporter shouted the first question over the noise. "Ms. Calhoun, why didn't you speak during the flight?" Zarina didn't hesitate. "Because sometimes silence is the most powerful protest," she said. "But only if you know when to break it." The room held its breath. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. The woman they hadn't seen coming had already said everything that mattered, without raising her voice. 1 week after the incident, Nova Air headquarters didn't feel like the same place. The glass walls still gleamed, the security badges still beeped at the entrances, but something quieter had shifted. A poster now hung across the main lobby, Simple black letters on a clean white background. Respect doesn't depend on titles, skin tones, or seating class. It starts with you. Zarina Calhoun. Employees passed it every morning. Some read it and nodded. Others looked away. But no one could pretend it wasn't there. On the top floor, Zarina sat alone in a small conference room, sipping lukewarm coffee. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the HVAC and the occasional shuffle of paper. In front of her was the first report from Noviair's anonymous feedback system, rolled out just 3 days ago. It wasn't long, but it was honest. Comments from flight attendants, baggage handlers, and even a few passengers filled the short document. Most were simple. Thank you. We see the difference. Please keep going. A few still pushed back, called it unnecessary, reactionary. But even that was data. Even that meant people were paying attention. Zarina leaned back in her chair, fingers tracing the edge of the table. She felt a sense of lightness, but not pride. Not exactly. This wasn't a victory, it was a start. A shift. She thought about how many years she'd spent navigating rooms, just like this one. Dressed perfectly, speaking carefully, never letting emotion show. How often she'd swallowed something sharp to keep the peace. She still wasn't sure if she'd done enough. But for once, she wasn't asking permission to try. A soft knock tapped on the door before it opened. Ethan stepped in, holding 2 paper cups. I wasn't sure if you'd want more, he said, handing one over. Zarina accepted it with a nod. How'd you know I finished the first one? You don't strike me as the type to leave a job half done, he smiled. She laughed gently, eyes back on the report. Read it still talking? Oh, yeah, he said, sitting across from her. They're calling you the quiet CEO. You're a meme now. A good one. Zarina raised an eyebrow. Can't wait to see that. He shrugged. Could be worse. She looked up, meeting his gaze. Let them talk. I'm not done working. Ethan nodded, a little more serious this time. They're listening now. That's something. Downstairs, on a muted TV near the lobby, a news anchor gave a brief update. Former flight attendant Lydia Cresswell has refused interviews following her termination from Noviair last week. Multiple passengers have since come forward, citing past experiences with her on board. The airline CEO Zarina Calhoun continues to lead a sweeping policy overhaul focused on anti-discrimination and accountability. It was a small segment, 30 seconds, maybe less. But it said enough. The narrative had changed. Lydia's action wasn't being treated as a fluke anymore. It was now the face of unchecked power. And Zarina had become the face of something else entirely. At Midvale Regional Airport, later that afternoon, Zarina waited at the VIP lounge for her flight to Denver. The space was quiet, just a few business travelers sipping club soda and scrolling through emails. She stood near the window, watching the runway as planes taxied under the afternoon sun. A young flight attendant approached her nervous, but smiling. She was Asian American, mid-20s maybe, hair tied back tightly. Ms. Calhoun, she asked. Zarina turned. Yes. The woman swallowed before speaking. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did. My mom used to clean planes. She used to say no one ever saw her, not really. But you made her proud. Zarina's expression softened. She reached out, rested a hand gently on the woman's shoulder. Then let's make sure no one forgets women like your mom were always passengers too, she said. Just never seen. The woman blinked fast, then nodded. Safe travels. Zarina smiled, then turned back to the window. A few minutes later, her flight was called. She boarded quietly, no cameras, no introductions. Just another passenger on another flight. As the plane lifted into the sky, she rested her head against the window and looked out across the clouds. The sun caught the wing just right, casting a soft golden glow. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel finished. But she did feel ready. Justice doesn't land overnight, she thought. But if I keep flying, maybe it'll catch up. In a world where silence is often mistaken for weakness, sometimes the most powerful act is knowing exactly when to speak. Zarina didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. And in doing so, reminded us all that dignity shouldn't depend on status, and respect shouldn't come with conditions. What would you have done in her place? And more importantly, what will you do the next time silence begs to be broken? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next one. There's always more to uncover, one voice at a time.